Bibliophiles of the internet, today I'm here to finally share my overall reading stats for 2025. If you've been here for a minute, you may know that I typically share my reading stats on a quarterly basis, and the fourth quarter is where things get a little bit tricky because I don't know my fourth quarter stats until the end of the year, but then of course I also have my reading stats for the entire year at that point. Last year I kind of split the difference by doing a 2-in-1 video where I went over all of my usual stats and basically showed two data sets for each category, one for the fourth quarter and one for the entire year. That, as you can imagine, was an exceptional amount of work, so I will not be doing that again. For some of these stats, we'll briefly touch on the fourth quarter, but for the most part, this is going to be year-end stuff, stats that look at the totality of 2025. So with that bit of housekeeping behind us, let's jump right in. Starting, as always, with the big picture number of how many books I read, first for the fourth quarter and then for the entire year. And in the fourth quarter, I read 16 books in October, 14 books in November, 21 books in December, for a total of 51 books. That means roughly a third, or around 30% of the books I read for the entire year were books I read during the fourth quarter. And the total number of books I read in 2025 was a nice round number of 175 books. To properly put that in perspective, that is the most books I've read in a single year since 2014. Between 2014 and now, the biggest reading year I've had was back in 2019 when I read 143 books. So I bested that by a margin of 32 books. Again, I'm not really a numbers guy. I'm not big on reading quantity or numerical-based reading goals. That is not at the forefront of my mind when I approach what I read and how I read, but I'm still pretty proud of myself for that, if only because it means I'm making at least some kind of dent in the endless number of books that I want to try and read in my life. If we look at the quarterly breakdown, that means I did about 21% of my reading in the first quarter, 23% in the second quarter, 26% in the third quarter, and like I said, roughly 29% in the fourth quarter. So actually a pretty steady increase across 2025. Just to give the fourth quarter its due, I'll quickly go over what I read for October, November, and December. Like I said, I read 16 books in October. Those were The Transition, A Sunny Place for Shady People, Strange Houses, Strange Pictures, The Isle in the Silver Sea, Chicano Frankenstein, Stitch, The Art of Catching Feelings, If the Dead Belong Here, The Corruption of Hollis Brown, The Dead of Summer, Mood Machine, Dead and Breakfast, The Center, Never Ever After, and The Six Deaths of the Saint. I read 14 books in November. Those were The Devil She Knows, The Everlasting, Big Chief, An Academy for Liars, Starship, Hamnet, The Boy Who Lost Fairyland, The Girl Who Raced Fairyland All the Way Home, Legendary Fry Bread Drive-In, After Hours at Dooryard Books, How Far the Light Reaches, Rock Your Mocks, At Our Table, and This Gilded Abyss. And in December, I read an absolutely unhinged, at least for me, 21 books. Those were We Will Rise Again, Metal from Heaven, Hollow Magic, According to Plan, Canto Contigo, One Day in June, Best Woman, Last First Kiss, Dear Mothman, All the White Spaces, Nobody's Baby, One Word, Six Letters, Holly, The Ragpicker King, The Rushworth Family Plot, Good Spirits, The Strength of the Few, Morris, Cecilia, B. Mullins Takes a Shot, and Every Day I Read. Now let's talk about the number of pages I read, starting with the fourth quarter, in which I read 15,843 pages. Looking at the entirety of 2025, I very nearly read 55,000 pages, coming in just a bit shy at 54,913 pages. That means at 175 books read, that averages out to about 313 pages per book. Let's move right along to my top 5 most read genres of the year, going in ascending order. Starting with historical fiction, coming in at 19 books. Then we have horror at 21 books. Just barely edging it out is science fiction at 22 books. My second most read genre was contemporary fiction at 35 books. And coming in at the top, making a huge comeback, is fantasy books. I read 36 fantasy books in 2025. Being such an eclectic reader can be so strange sometimes, because looking back at the year, do I feel like it was an especially fantasy-heavy reading year? Not really, but the numbers don't lie, and that means about 1 in every 5 times, roughly 21% of the time, I was reaching for a fantasy book in 2025. As always, as a certified bona fide queer, I love to tabulate how many queer books I read every quarter and every year. So starting with the fourth quarter, I read a total of 26 queer books. That makes up about 51%, or just a little over half, of all the books I read in the last quarter of the year, which, especially taking the Queer Lit Readathon into consideration, absolutely makes sense. For the entire year, I read a total of 102 queer books, which again makes up more than half of my overall reading in 2025, about 58% to be exact. Now let's talk about reading format, which basically means the medium through which I'm consuming stories. Looking at the entire year and going in ascending order, we start with hybrid/mixture, which denotes a book that I consumed in at least 2 different formats, and I did 8 hybrid reads in the entirety of 2025. Next, we have ebooks. This is typically but not always galleys, but either way, I read 18 books books as ebooks. Next, we have physical books. 50 of the books I read last year were read as physical books, which of course, surprising no one, means that audiobooks absolutely dominated with 99 total books read solely as audiobooks. Honestly, I'm pretty happy with that breakdown. This is one of many reasons why I love doing these stats videos, because it shows me my patterns and my habits. Knowing that audiobooks are my most engaged with format helps me to make better decisions about what I read and how I read going forward. So this is all good stuff. Continuing on, since we talked about page count, it's only fair to talk about how many hours I spent listening to audiobooks. In the fourth quarter, I spent about 327.5 hours listening to audiobooks. And looking at the entirety of 2025, I spent a whopping 1,072.25 hours listening to audiobooks, which honestly was time very well spent. Next, we're going to go over audience spread, which is basically another way of saying which target audiences or age demographics the books I read fell into. Once again, looking at the entire year and going in ascending order, there was only one book that could be categorized as new adult, so thank you to Johnny for their service. This next category is one that actually did not exist for me in the first half of the year, but I did end up reading a handful of picture books this past year, which I have categorized as children's books. And so with that in mind, I read 5 children's books. My third most read demographic was middle grade. I read 16 middle grade books. My second most read demographic was young adults. I read 31 YA books. And as you might be able to guess, my most read demographic of the year by a pretty significant margin was adult. I read 122 adult books. For this next category, I just so happened to read both my longest book and shortest book of the entire year in the fourth quarter. So there's a little bit of redundancy here, but I'll quickly go through this just for the sake of science. Starting with the longest book I read according to page count for both the fourth quarter and the entire year, which was definitely The Strength of the Few by James Islington, which clocked in at a whopping 720 pages. If I were to give some honorable mentions to the runners-up, those would be Swordcatcher by Cassandra Clare at 624 pages and The Paying Guest by Sarah Waters at 608 pages. The shortest book I read according to page count for both the fourth quarter and the entire year was The Six Deaths of the Saint by Alexi Hara, which is a short story told in just 30 pages. Again, if I were to give an honorable mention to the runner-up, that would be Rock Your Mocks, written by Laurel Goodluck and illustrated by Madeline Goodnight. This is one of the picture books I read, which is just about 32 pages. Again, a bit of redundancy here, but looking at the longest and shortest audiobooks for the year, the longest audiobook was, unsurprisingly, The Strength of the Few by James Islington, read by Ewan Morton and clocking in at 31 hours and 8 minutes. And again, unsurprisingly, my shortest audiobook for the year was The Six Deaths of the Saint by Alexi Hara, read by Saskia Marleveld and coming in at 51 minutes. I do just want to state for the record that I fucking hate that my longest and shortest audiobooks were both Bezos exclusives. In fairness, I definitely did not pay full price for either one of them, but I really and truly try to not support that man's empire with every fiber of my being every single day that I draw breath, but that's just how the chips fell in 2025. Moving right along to my most read authors of the year. For this stat, I only counted authors I read 3 or more books from in 2025. There were quite a few authors I read at least 2 books from this past year, so if I had included all of those, we'd be here for quite some time. So with that criteria in mind, my 3 most read authors of 2025 were Peter Brown at 3 books, Moses Osei-Otomi at 3 books, and Cat Sebastian at the top with 6 books. Speaking of authors, let's look at how many new authors I read from in 2025. This means any authors I read from for the very first time, whether they were debut authors or authors who've been publishing that I had not read from previously. And in total, I read from 87 new authors. To get a bit more specific, 23 of those authors were debut authors, meaning I read the first book they ever published, and 64 of those authors were new to me authors, which again means they had previously published, possibly more than once, and I was simply reading from them for the very first time. I will say, take these numbers with several grains of salt, because some authors I read more than one book from are tabulated in my spreadsheet as both a new author and a repeat author. For example, when I read The Lies of the Ajongo, Moses Osei-Otomi was logged as a new to me author, but then he was logged again as a repeat author for the next 2 books in the series, which I also read in 2025. And while we're on the topic of repeat authors, by which I mean authors I have read from before and returned to in 2025, 86 of the books I read, give or take, were written by repeat authors. We'll take a quick look at my average star rating for the year, which averaged out to about 4.2 stars. And yes, this does account for half stars and quarter stars. And related to star ratings, I thought it would be fun to look at all my 5-star reads for 2025. Last year, 24 of the books I read were books I ended up giving 5 stars. That That means about 14% of the books I read last year turned out to be 5-star books. That may not sound like a lot, it may not seem like an especially good hit rate, but there's more nuance to this, of course. I read a lot of really incredible, unforgettable stories that may not have been rated 5 stars in the end, but were still very meaningful and impactful for me, so you won't see those represented on this chart, but that's also something to keep in mind. I also think it's notable that a not insignificant number of nonfiction books I picked up last year are books that ended up being 5-star books. Again, that's a good little nugget for me to take away when I think about the books I want to read in 2026. Really stellar, informative, thoughtful nonfiction seems to have a pretty good turnover rate, so to speak. Now let's talk about my top 5 most read publishers for the year, once again going in ascending order from least read to most read. Starting with HarperCollins at 17 books. Then we have Hachette at 18 books, Simon & Schuster at 19 books, then we skyrocket up to Macmillan at 42 books, and taking the crown for 2025 was none other than Penguin Random House at 51 books. This next category is one of my favorite ones to talk about every quarter and every year. That is the most popular cover colors. As a quick note, this is more of a vibe than a science. Many covers, as you know, are multicolored, and the reading of certain colors can be a bit subjective. I've done my best to consider what I believe is the dominant color for each book, the color that most draws the eye. You may not agree with some of my choices, and that's okay, because guess what? We're all gonna live. With that said, the top 5 most popular cover colors for 2025 were black books, of which I read 15. Red and pink were tied at 4th place at 17 books apiece. Then we have purple books, which came in at 19 books. The second most popular color was green at 21 books. And once again, proving that she is indeed that bitch, is the color blue at a whopping 49 books. Now let's do some series tracking and talk about all the books I read that were part of series. I believe for 2025, I read 37 books that were part of 28 different series. So let's quickly go over those. I read all 3 books in the Wild Robot series. I read both books currently published in the Ebony Song series. I read the last book in the Green Sisters Companion series. I also completed the Great Cities and Space Between Worlds duologies, assuming the latter is a duology, of course. I read both currently published books in the Chronicles of Castellane series. I read the latest novella in the Massa and Pleiti series. I read both currently published books in the Shadow of the Leviathan series. I read 1 book in the Librarians in Love Companion series, which is the only book in that series I care to read. Thank you very much. I read the first book in Joe Abercrombie's New Devil series. I completed the Mage by Courier duology, the Darkness Outside Us duology, and the I Feed Her to the Beast duology. I also read the first book in the Volatile Memory novella series. I don't know whether it's a duology, but I'm gonna say I completed the Lesbiana's Guide series. I read all 3.5 books in the Turner series. I read all 3 books in the Forever Desert trilogy, and I read both Monk and Robot novellas as well. I also caught up with the Sworn Soldier series, started the Dead of Summer duology, and also finally completed the Fairyland series after an 8-year hiatus. I read the first book in the Titan's Wrath trilogy. I read the latest novella in the Dorothy Gentleman novella series. I read the holiday novella that's part of the Belladonna series. I also read the latest book in the Mr. Darcy and Miss Tilney murder mystery series. Good Spirits is the first book in a planned companion series of paranormal romances, and I read that. And finally, I caught up with the Hierarchy series by reading The Strength of the Few. I mentioned this in my December wrap-up, but I wanted to point out once again that every single series I either started or continued with in 2025 that I intend to continue on with is a series that I either completed or caught up with completely in 2025, which I think is pretty cool. Comparing the number of books in series versus standalones, again, I read 37 books in series, which means I read a whopping 138 standalone books. Looking at the number of new releases I read last year, I read 91 books that were published for the first time in 2025. That means just over half of all the books I read last year, or about 52%, were new releases. Conversely, the number of backlist books I read, in other words, any books published prior to 2025, was 84 books. I'm actually pretty pleased with that because that means it was very nearly a 50-50 split, which I think for me is a pretty good balance. The most backlist book I read in 2025 was, of course, the classic novel Morris by E.M. Forster, which was published in 1971. Technically, it's even more backlist than that because Forster didn't give consent for Morris to be published until after his death because homosexuality was unfortunately outlawed for almost the entirety of his life. But he actually finished the manuscript, I believe, in 1913. Fun fact. And just for the sake of curiosity, if we took Morris out of the equation, the second most backlist book I read in 2025 was The Paying Guest by Sarah Waters, which was published in 2014. I usually break down the most popular locations where my books are set, but I'm going to skip that for this video and pick it up again in the first quarter stats video for 2026. So for today, I'm just going to go straight into my library savings for 2025. I am a forever defender and lover of the library. I try to use mine every single chance I get, even though it's not always possible for every book I pick up. But in the fourth quarter, I did have 7 checkouts. I checked out 2 physical books, 2 ebooks, and 3 audiobooks, saving myself $150.55. For the entire year, I had a total of 30 checkouts, 5 ebooks, 9 physical books, and 16 audiobooks, which ultimately saved me $681.87. Pretty good stuff. Typically, if this were a quarterly stats video, I would end by sharing my top 5 favorite books of the quarter. But I did recently share my favorite books of 2025 video, which I will link up above and down below. But just to name at least 5 standouts from the fourth quarter for posterity, I would say my favorites were Mood Machine by Liz Pelly, The Everlasting by Alexi Harrow, Starshipped by Kat Sebastian, According to Plan by Kristen Randall, and I think Good Spirits by B.K. Borison. So there you have it. We have finally put a bookend on 2025 and accounted for all the stats and all the things. If you have any interesting reading stats to share for the year, or if you want to gush about the books that stood out to you the most in 2025, I would love to hear all about it down below in the comments. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed, and until next time, educate yourself, be kind to yourself, take care of yourself and others, and I will catch you on the flip side of the page.